Hey, my name is Sass, and this is my economy and well-being gauntlet. Student loan debt is something that people talk to me about all the time as a big issue, and there are a variety of mixed opinions on it that I find. But really, the way I view it is, I just see it as a burden and a leech on our economy. And I do believe in the simultaneous two things at the same time: canceling all student loan debt, as well as making public colleges and universities free at the same time. Some people say it's elitist. Some people say it's, it's going to give a bunch of money to banks. But I just want to move on, wipe my hands clean, and be done with it. I think it's ridiculous that we charge people money for education in the first place. That is just total nonsense. Canceling student debt, we can actually just do with printing money. Most of that money is either just going to go into the hands of consumers, where it will increase capacity utilization, which I might talk about a little bit more as we get more into the economy, or end up in banks where it doesn't circulate through the economy anyway. So we don't have a problem with inflation there. And sustainably paying for college, well, we're going to come back around to that in a little bit. We have a ton of egregiously wealthy individuals in the United States. But even more so than that, we have a lot of egregiously overworth corporations. So combined market cap of the two largest American corporations is far greater than the combined net worth of the 400 richest American individuals. There's a lot that we need to do to make sure that they're actually paying the part of the taxes that they need to. The simplest thing we can do is fully fund and support the IRS. And their main mission is to go after these taxes that are being avoided in both of those sectors. But in addition to that, I believe in implementing a value-added tax, which is a transactional tax on nearly all consumption except staple goods. And that includes business-to-business transactions, which feeds into a universal basic income to ensure that money is actually just going right back into the hands of the people. So I see this as a couple really powerful ways to ensure that we're actually getting the money that we're supposed to. I'd love to go through and simplify the tax code all the way down. And if there's an opportunity to do that, I will. But I'm also understand the reality that we live in of I'm working with other people in Congress who are being lobbied by TurboTax and H&R Block. So it's really about trying to find realistic solutions to the problems that we're dealing with. And that's what I'm going to do. Everything in moderation. The world is not ready for open borders, but isolation isn't going to work either. And right now, the United States is too reliant on other countries, particularly China, for all sorts of our goods. We saw this throughout the pandemic, where the supply chain madness that we're dealing with right now is devastating. We've also, of course, seen an offshoring of jobs. We've seen how that affects wages and unemployment. There are a variety of things that need to happen. It's 1,000 little things, including regulation and various types of legislation. But a huge piece of this is to ensure that what's happening here in the country stays in the country is, as I was talking about before, a value-added tax specifically to fund a universal basic income. Because it's a transactional tax, if it's sold in the U.S., it's getting taxed in the U.S. unavoidably, and that money is going to go right back to the people. We talk about underemployment and unemployment all the time. A lot of people don't realize half the country doesn't work for a wage, which is why I'm in favor of an unconditional basic income. And that's because moving into the 21st century and the information age, we need to start thinking about work in a different way and guaranteeing people's right to life. There are a variety of requirements that we can put on corporations to, have, if they want to be headquartered in the United States, then a certain percentage of their business or their manufacturing needs to happen here, as well as just a variety of economic incentives. But securing our supply chain domestically is incredibly important as a national security issue beyond just an economic issue. So there's no single thing when it comes to trade. There's a whole lot of variety of different things going on here, but it's absolutely a problem that we can address with creative solutions and just collective action and working together to drive our representatives to do what they need to do. Social Security, retirement benefits, survivors benefits, disability insurance, too low, straight up. Now, I'm actively fighting for an unconditional basic income that stacks with all of those programs to get all of those folks an extra $1,000 a month, $1,500, $2,000 a month. But should an opportunity come by to expand Social Security, I would absolutely be for it. As well as part of how I fund the universal basic income is by eliminating the taxable earnings cap on Social Security. which would allow the fund to be flush for at least another 40 years. That's really all it comes down to. Again, it's guaranteeing people's right to life, and it's taking care of each other. And so I'm absolutely in favor of getting money into people's hands because that's how this country works. And I have nothing against making sure that people can actually make their lives work in this country. Jobs are a relic of the 20th century. Today, in the information age, we have all sorts of robots, automation, machines, artificial intelligence that is automating away so many of our so-called jobs, which are really just this very narrow slice of labor that's restricted within a much broader scope of work. And this is why I instead fight for an unconditional basic income. I'm not asking for nicer chains, I'm fighting for freedom. It is time to move on from this old way of thinking that everybody needs to slave away in order to deserve to live. I want to give you freedom to choose what to do with your time, and to start recognizing the types of work that people do that are important that we don't pay for, such as child rearing, taking care of elderly or sick family members, volunteering, freelance work, artistry. These are all important things. We don't recognize it. An unconditional basic income will unlock people's potential. It will increase productivity. It will pull people out of poverty and remove their scarcity mentality to allow them to actually pursue what they want to do. And it will also allow us to use automation to make our lives better rather than worse. So I'm incredibly focused on unconditional basic income as the real 21st century solution to this lack of jobs. Because honestly, jobs are not the future. Freedom is. Secondary education costs have just gotten out of control. And whether we're talking about public colleges or universities, talking about trade schools, vocational schools, certification programs, apprenticeship programs, it is long past time for us to say, why are we charging people money for school? As I said earlier, I believe in doing two things simultaneously: canceling all student debt, as well as making all of the secondary education the public secondary education free. A lot of the reason the costs have gotten out of control is administrative nonsense. They're positions that people end up taking because they know somebody and they don't actually do any work. They just get paid egregious sums of money. And if we make it so that way, the federal government becomes the negotiator for these prices rather than individual students who are locked into these ridiculous student loan programs, then we can actually leverage that to get colleges and universities to lower their administrative costs and make it reasonable. And paying for this is not out of the question. It only feels that way because it's currently so expensive. But there are a lot of things we pay for that we don't need to. The money is there, whether you're talking about reducing spending on military and focusing on military contractors, focusing on education, or just universal health care and all the money we would save from that. We can absolutely pay for secondary education for everybody, as well as increasing focus on alternative secondary education. That's not just colleges and universities. More than half the country doesn't have a four-year degree, and many of those who do, at least frankly lately, regret it. So I'm absolutely in favor of making all public secondary education free. We can absolutely do it. It's not a difficult thing to do. But we can also shift our focus and broaden the types of education that people can receive. The scope of our environmental crisis is quite literally unfathomable. It is too large to fit inside of our heads. And there's a survivor bias issue at play as well. Everybody who's died from poor air quality, floods and droughts, famines, heat waves, natural disasters, they're not around any longer to tell us how bad it is. And that's 12.8 million people per year dying due to unhealthy environments. That is more people than have died from COVID-19 so far. It's a lot of people, and that's every single year. There's not a single wealthy nation in the world doing even close to enough to address this issue. Of course, our number one focus needs to be on carbon in the atmosphere and oceans, but of course it's also deforestation, it's human-led mass extinction, it's pollution of our rivers, it's microplastics in the ocean that end up in our own bodies. There are so many different things that we need to address in addition to, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, getting ourselves off of pulling carbon out from deep underground and burning it and putting it into the atmospheres and oceans. But we're also, there's a ton of work that needs to be done, which will fit very well into our current economic model. But some things won't, namely carbon capture and storage. So pulling carbon out of the atmospheres and oceans and storing it deep underground where we got it from in the first place, geologic sequestration. There's no profit motive there. This is just something that wealthy countries are going to have to put up and shut up about. But it's that or natural disaster. Natural disaster is going to be way, way more expensive. And we're also going to have to come up with mitigation techniques. We are so far behind on this. We're not going to be able to catch up or totally reverse it, quote unquote, in time. We're going to have to figure out, how we can grow food or indoors for the full masses of all people. And the number of issues that we're dealing with are just so expansive. And what we really need are modern representatives who have a modern understanding and look at the data, make prioritized decisions based on the data and what we really see and what's actually going to be effective. Right now, we just have a whole bunch of representatives who are being lobbied by these fossil fuel corporations. And unfortunately, that's killing millions of people around the world every year. So there are a variety of things in my platform when we eventually talk about democracy on how we can shift that around, because we need sustainable solutions. It's not going to be any one single bill, but I'm absolutely on the side of fighting to fix the planet that we call home. A lot of people have been fighting for $15 federal minimum wage. If that was the only thing we did, it could cause problems. Why? Because half the country doesn't work for a wage. How is it going to help them? Obviously, some folks have somebody else in their home who is making a minimum wage, but many don't, whether it's folks who are disabled, whether it's folks on Social Security, even homeless folks. And in rural areas that don't have, that maybe are very, very sparsely populated, if all we did was increase the federal minimum wage, we could actually end up hurting some of those folks who are even more vulnerable than the folks who are currently making a minimum wage. I would be in favor of raising the federal minimum wage if we did it alongside increasing the fixed incomes in every other sector at the same time. So Social Security and all our federal welfare benefits. But I think a much better option is an unconditional basic income, a guarantee to ensure that you are always able to pay for your basic needs and that you don't have to be a slave to an employer. Again, I'm not asking for nicer change. I'm fighting for freedom. So that's what my focus is. I do support municipalities and other variety of smaller jurisdictions raising the minimum wage if that makes sense for them. I think it does make sense for cities to do it. I do think morally it's abhorrent to pay anybody less than a living wage, but practically, the real solution is to stop focusing on this 20th century concept of jobs and focus on a 21st century of freedom. And that's what an unconditional basic income will help us to achieve. I'm super pro-union. I love unions. The concept is fantastic. Unfortunately, we've seen lots of technology and 21st century techniques being used to bust unions, which is awful. Again, this is why I fight for an unconditional basic income. I think this is a simpler solution to some of these problems we've been seeing. But that doesn't mean that my support for unions has wavered. I am actually personally working to start up a co-op. I don't have any details about that right now for you, but working together and the collective power of workers, I think, is an incredibly important part of ensuring that people are taken care of and get what they need and that we can achieve what we want. So I am absolutely in support of all legislation to empower unions and empower union members to ensure that the membership has control of the negotiation process. Centralization of power always tends to be the issue. So building the mechanics to ensure that the power stays with the workers, with the people, is the most important thing. So I am super pro-union, and I want to do everything I can to help them out. We've got a ton of monopolies going on in our country, particularly in the tech sector, but there's so many that go so much more under the radar. We've seen time and time again how oversized monopolies can be devastating for the American people and even the world at large. I actually want to take this opportunity to talk about the tech sector specifically because I think that this is where Congress is lacking the most in terms of understanding. We have a lot of representatives who are stuck in the 20th century and don't live in today's age. When we look at social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, these just behemoths, there's a lot of undue power that they have over our speech. You know, legally, if you read the language, the First Amendment does not prevent Facebook or Twitter from banning you or censoring you, but I do recognize the importance of that. I think the approach needs to be a more global approach with some of these companies. I think the United Nations needs to recognize large social media companies, or large social media platforms, I should say, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, TikTok, as digital countries. And the power in that is just like the United Nations has a list of human rights for physical countries. The United Nations can come up with a list of human rights for digital citizens in digital countries. That can include things like full and clear disclosure about community agreements. That can include things like data and privacy protections to actually ensure that people are informed on how they're interacting. I do think it needs to be a global conversation. I don't think we should be forcing our American culture on the entire world. But beyond that, if we're talking about breaking up monopolies, I am generally in favor of ensuring, creating custom pieces of legislation for different companies. I think it's ridiculous that Amazon has its fingers in just so many sectors. The way that Amazon subsidized its retail delivery for so long on the back of Amazon Web Services, that was basically just a money printer. Thinking about how we can separate these up in proper ways. But again, it also comes back to the value-added tax to ensure that business-to-business transactions are unavoidably taxed at the point of sale. That's talking about every Facebook ad, every Google search, every Amazon sale. That's how we get the money out of these companies and get it into your hands in the form of an unconditional basic income. I know specific companies I want to list in terms of breaking up. We have to be methodical and careful about how we approach this. I do think that it is a space for a collective conversation and how to approach it. We definitely need a lot of creativity and more modern solutions, but generally I am on the side of antitrust because having that much centralized power, as I talked about with union advancement, just doesn't work out well for anybody.